Coming up on The World Today. UN chief urges more effort to ensure access to Ukrainian grain as he visits Ukrainian port of Odessa. Today is observed as World Humanitarian Day around the world, celebrated to honor individuals who indulge in humanitarian work. North Korea's Kim Jong-un praises military medics for frontline COVID fight in Pyongyang. Welcome this Friday. I'm Melissa Ntumwaka in Lagos. We begin with news just a few minutes ago. Russian President Vladimir Putin agreeing to send a mission of experts from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron expressed his concern over the safety of the site during a phone call, according to a readout sent to journalists by Mr. Macron's office. According to a Kremlin readout of the call, Mr. Putin said shelling of the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia plant he blamed on Kyiv, said he created a risk of large-scale catastrophe. Both leaders agreed on the need to send a team from the IAEA to the plant. The Russian president also spoke to his counterparts in France about continuing obstacles to supplying Russian food and fertilizer products to world markets. The two presidents agreed to continue their talks in the coming days. And now to the front lines in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the residents of two villages in Russia's Belgorod region on Ukraine's northeastern border have been evacuated after a fire at a munitions depot near the village of Tomonovo. The fire is the latest in a series of destructive incidents on Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine or inside Russia itself. Roughly 1,100 people live in the villages of Tomonovo and Soloti, about 15 miles from the Ukrainian border. There were no casualties in late Thursday's blaze, the Belgorod region's governor said. But Russian forces struck a temporary base of foreign mercenaries in Ukraine's Kharkiv city with ground-based high-precision weapons. Russia's defense ministry said in a daily news release that the Russian aerospace forces struck the Adayivka region near Donetsk, as well as the assembling areas of Ukrainian troops and military equipment in Kherson and Mykolaiv regions. Russian artillery also launched strikes on Ukrainian troops in the Donetsk region. The regional staff of the Ukrainian armed forces said on the same day that Russian forces are concentrating on trying to take full control of Luhansk and Donetsk regions. They're consolidating the newly occupied parts of Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia and Mykolaiv in order to store strength to advance attacks in certain directions. The Russian forces also continue to block Ukrainian maritime traffic in the Black Sea. According to Ukraine's news, Sergei Gidey, military administrator of the Luhansk region appointed by Ukraine, he said the Ukrainian army currently controls only 2 settlements in the Luhansk region. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa, where he was joined by the country's infrastructure minister and the city's mayor. Mr. Guterres said there was still much more to do to ensure full global access to Ukrainian food products and Russian food and fertilizers after the UN-brokered food export deal. He added that developing countries needed help to purchase such grain and called for unimpeded access to global markets for Russian food and fertilizer, which are not subject to sanctions.
It's time for massive and generous support so developing countries can purchase the food from these and other ports and people can buy it. Developing countries need access to financing now. They need debt relief now, and they need resources to invest in their people now. This is an agreement between 2 parties locked in a bitter war. It is unprecedented in scope and scale, but there is still a long way to go on many fronts. Getting more food and fertilizer out of Ukraine and Russia is crucial to further calm commodity markets and lower prices. Other parts that are also important and we have been defending relate to the unimpeded access to the global markets of Russian food and fertilizers, which are not subject to sanctions. It is important that all governments and the private sector cooperate to bring them to market.
And earlier, before his visit to Odessa, visiting United Nations Secretary General made a statement at a joint press conference held with the Ukrainian president and Turkish President Erdogan in Ukraine's city of Lviv. The parties talked about the UN's role in ensuring security at Zaporizhia's nuclear power plant, stressing the need for demilitarization of the plant. Of course, July 22nd, Ukraine signed the deal with Turkey and the UN to resume food and fertilizer shipments. Last week, we know concerning the nuclear power plant, Ukraine and Russia exchanged accusations over the strike on the plant, which is one of the largest atomic power complexes in Europe. Well, let's move on. Also in the United States, they are deeply concerned about Russia's military presence in the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. According to the State Department spokesperson Ned Price, the International Atomic Energy Agency should be granted access to facilities. This was said earlier yesterday.
The United States remains deeply concerned about Russia's military takeover and continued control of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The International Atomic Energy Agency must be given access to ZNPP as soon as possible and in a manner that respects Ukraine's full sovereignty to help ensure the safety and security of the plant and monitoring of its nuclear material. Brutality has been a hallmark of Russia's war against Ukraine. The United States is aware of reports that Russian personnel have abused and coerced members of the ZNPP staff. We applaud the Ukrainian authorities and operators for their commitment to nuclear safety and security under the most trying of circumstances. The United States condemns in the strongest terms Russia's reckless disregard for nuclear safety and security. Along with our allies and partners, we call on Russia to cease all military operations at or near Ukraine's nuclear facilities and to return full control of the ZNPP to Ukraine. We continue to support the efforts of the International Atomic Energy Agency to fulfill its safeguards mandate and to assist Ukraine with nuclear safety and security measures across its nuclear facilities.
Joining us right now to talk more about this, Christian Arinze, Senior Engineer, Nuclear Security and Non-Proliferation Expert at the Nigerian Nuclear Regulatory Authority. He joins me now on the risks in the Zaporizhia area. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
First, I'd like to get your thoughts. This is also news just coming in that Russia has indeed approved for the IAEA agency to indeed mission of experts to, go into Zaporizhia. What do you make of this news just breaking?
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, it's a welcome development for Russia to grant. Hello?
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Okay, it's a welcome development. This is this is what we have been waiting for. Russia has been reckless in its behavior in terms of nuclear safety and allowing the staff, which are critical components of the plant operation system, to have access and to work, discharge their duties without any coercion. Is a good development in terms of safety.
And talking about that, because, they're still playing the blame game. Russia is accusing Ukraine of the shelling. Ukraine is accusing Russia. As an expert, explain to us what is in Zaporizhia and the kind of danger, the risks that it poses.
Okay, thank you. Well, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is in southeastern part of Ukraine. It straddles the river Dnipro. On the western flank is occupied by Ukrainian forces, and the eastern part is occupied by Russian forces. And Russian forces uses the nuclear power plant as a sort of staging ground to launch consistent attacks on the Ukrainian position, thereby provoking the Ukrainians to retaliate, and thereby endangering the nuclear facility, which is one of the top nuclear facilities in the world, and in the entire continental Europe, it is the largest nuclear facility. That facility has 6 nuclear reactors that runs of the light water reactor type, specifically pressurized water reactors with a capacity of 950 megawatts each one. That is 6 by 950 megawatts, which is 5,700 total capacity of power per day. It was contracted between the reactor 1 to 5 was contracted between 1980 to 1985, and the 60 reactor was contracted in 1995, and the first 5 reactors went online between 1985 to 1986, and the last one came online in 2017 or thereabout. That facility is very strategic, given the role it plays in energy security of continental Europe. Recently, around February, Ukraine disconnected its grids from Russia in line with their vision of being a large player in the European energy markets. And then connecting their grid to the EU system. So I think that's even a possible provoking action from Ukraine that led Russia to actually try to undermine their nuclear facilities. And
Indeed.
Mind you,
the
Zaporizhia nuclear power plant isn't the only nuclear plant in Ukraine. They have other additional 5 nuclear power plants. So here at the Zaporizhia, we have a critical infrastructure that is currently at risk.
I was going to say as well that Ukrainian president did say that it appears Russia is trying to redirect, power to their own grid, at this point in time. But let's look at, some of what could occur. Experts are saying that if this whole shelling continues, they could have a Chernobyl catastrophe or a Fukushima. What do you think about evacuating those who are around that area? This is in hindsight of what might occur.
Thank you. Ukraine has about at least 5,000 radiation shelters. These are places where people take cover whenever there is a risk of radiological contamination. In terms of displacement, it's a possibility to relocate, as we can see at Enahoda, where about 3,000 people have been relocated, and in some other areas. So to avoid the risks associated with the shellings and collateral damage associated that might occur. In terms of evacuating people to other safe places, it might not actually solve the problem. The effective way out is to get Russia to de-escalate and then to create a sort of demilitarized zone to allow the nuclear engineers and technicians have access. And you know that ZMPP has over 10,000 staff working at that nuclear facility who are working under high condition of stress, under duress. They are at gunpoint with torture, and it is reported that some nuclear staff have disappeared. So this is a very dicey situation.
I cannot imagine what they are indeed going through psychologically. We appreciate your time. We will be following this latest development with Russia giving approval for the IAEA to indeed come in. I'd like to appreciate your time on the program. Christian Arinze, Senior Engineer, Nuclear Security Expert. Thank you for joining us on the program.
My pleasure.
To other stories, policymakers, lawmakers and insufficient oil and gas sector investments are to blame for high energy prices, not OPEC. This is according to the Secretary General, Haytham Al-Ghais. A lack of investment in the oil and gas sector following a price slump sparked by COVID-19 has significantly reduced OPEC's spare production capacity, also limited the group's ability to respond quickly to further potential supply disruption. Is that the price of Brent crude came close to an all-time high, $145 a barrel in March, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine exacerbated supply concerns. While prices have been declined, they are still painfully high for consumers and businesses on a global scale. Well, let's now go to the ongoing debate about nuclear power in Germany and Europe. The debate about nuclear energy is heating up Europe. Germany will soon decide on postponing the phase-out of its remaining nuclear power plants to compensate for energy shortages in winter. France is facing issues with nuclear power production due to the heat waves that hit Europe this summer. Meanwhile, Ukraine, the fighting there is causing nuclear worries, which we've just discussed. Let's go over to Berlin, where Deutsche Welle correspondent Andre Nepori joins me now. Hi, Andrea. Let's start with Germany. When can we expect a decision about the phase-out of the remaining nuclear power plants?
The decision should arrive by the end of August, maybe early September. We hope earlier. There were reports this week that internally the decision had already been taken, but the government denied those claims and said that we need to wait for the results of a stress test that is currently being conducted on the German grid to assess whether we do need that extra power coming from these 3 remaining power plants during the winter, or if we could do without. We're talking about 3 nuclear power plants that are producing currently 5.6% of Germany's electricity. That doesn't sound like much, but proponents, of course, say that in winter we will need all of the sources we can put our hands on, including these 3 nuclear power plants. They were expected to be shut down on December 31st, 2022. The extension that is being proposed will keep them alive, so to say, until maybe March or April, and then they will be shut down anyway.
And at the same time, your neighbor, France, is the second global producer of nuclear power after the United States. How is that going for them?
Right now, not very well. Until last year, the answer would have been quite different. In 2021, France produced 70% of its electricity with nuclear power. Right now, experts are saying that in 2022, we don't have the figures yet, but they're saying that we're going to see probably the lowest level of energy produced by nuclear in France since 3 decades. The reason for that is twofold. Out of the 56 reactors that France has active right now are currently offline due to maintenance, repair, or refueling. And at the same time, a few important power plants are running at limited capacity because of the heat wave. They cannot use the warmer river water to cool down the reactors due to environmental reasons. That means that France, which is usually a huge exporter of electricity here in Europe, has now become a big importer. And they're importing at very high cost. Of course, energy costs more right now. That has already affected the balance of EDF, so the energy supplier in France, and the company reported losses of 5.3 billion euros in the first half of 2022, and it's now in the process of being fully nationalized by the French government.
And I've just been speaking with an expert, about the war in Ukraine and the news about the fighting around the nuclear power plants in Zaporizhzhia. How is that affecting the debate about nuclear power in Europe?
Well, yes, the Russian takeover of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine in March has already added a layer of complexity to an already complex debate. From one side, of course, the critics say that these shows that we need to consider for man-made disasters when it comes to nuclear safety, not just natural disasters. On the other hand, proponents of nuclear say that this is, of course, a dire situation, but it's nothing nothing to do with the intrinsic safety of nuclear itself. Regardless of the opinion, we always have to remember that here in Europe, the debate about nuclear is driven not just by science or strategy, but also a lot by emotion and by facts that have affected the public opinion in the past. We all remember the disaster of Chernobyl in 1986, and that was a turning point for the anti-nuclear sentiment and the anti-nuclear movements here in Europe. And policies in the years to follow were definitely skewed by that disaster. So we're back at talking about Ukraine and nuclear accident, and of course that evokes shadows of Chernobyl for us here in Europe. So far it hasn't affected policies yet. It's too early, but at the same time we're sure that this is going to be a big point of discussion in the nuclear debate here in Europe going forward.
Andrea Nepori, Deutsche Welle correspondent, joining us from Berlin. Many thanks. Still to come on The World Today. Fires, floods and storms continue to rage across the world. We have that story in a minute. Welcome back. On the 19th of August 2003, a bomb attack on the Canal Hotel in Baghdad, Iraq, killed 22 humanitarian aid workers, including the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Iraq, Sego Vieira de Mello. 5 years later, the UN's General Assembly adopted a resolution designating the day as World Humanitarian Day. Each year, WHD focuses on a theme, bringing together partners from across the humanitarian system to advocate for survival, well-being, dignity of people affected by crisis, and for the safety and security of aid workers. This year's campaign shines a light on the thousands of volunteers, professionals, crisis-affected people who deliver urgent health care, shelter, food, protection, water, and much more. Let's look at some facts and figures of the day. In 2021, 468 workers were attacked, 140 killed, 203 wounded, and 117 kidnapped. Of the aid workers who died, 98% were national staff, 2% were international staff, more than half, 53%, were staff of national NGOs. Most of the violence took place in South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Syria. Casualties are expected to rise significantly in 2022, and this is due to the war in Ukraine, where rocket attacks, shelling threaten civilians and aid providers equally. According to the UN's 2021 humanitarian needs overview, 12.1 million were estimated to be in acute need, which made Yemen the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. According to recent estimates, 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection in 2022, a significant increase from the figures in 2021. The Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs of the UN aims to help 183 million people in 63 nations this year. Well, joining me to talk more about this day is Yvonne Ndege, Regional Spokesperson, International Organization for Migration. She joins me now virtually from Nairobi. Thanks for joining me on the program.
My pleasure, Millicent.
It's World Humanitarian Day 2022. What do you think about this year's theme, It Takes a Village?
Well, the theme for the 2022 World Humanitarian Day, Millicent, focuses on the fact that just as it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to respond to global, national, local, regional humanitarian crisis going on around the world, which is currently affecting over 300 million people. What we find is that in most instances, the first to respond to crisis and conflict are people affected themselves, but there are other people who are also involved in the response to bring aid like shelter, like water, like medical care to people affected by crisis. And those are, as I said, those affected by the crisis, volunteers, UN agencies, medical staff, people who are working in the communities affected by crisis, NGOs, international NGOs, religious organizations. The point of the theme of World Humanitarian Day this year is to say that the response that we need to address the conflicts that we see going on around the world, and you mentioned some of them, the one affecting this region in particular, South Sudan and Ethiopia, actually comes from everybody. Everybody has a role to play in responding to the ongoing mega crises that we see, not just in the continent of Africa, but around the world, that are impacting the lives of so many women, children, and all kinds of people from all walks of life.
And Yvonne, humanitarian workers are increasingly becoming a target for these attacks. Why is this?
Well, that's right. At least 460 humanitarian workers have been killed since 2021. In 2022, at least 40 have faced life-threatening situations, if not being killed. And when we find that there is this disruption, if you like, to the situation of humanitarian workers trying to respond to needs, we find that they are also affected in different ways. Normally, there are obstacles to really delivering the humanitarian aid and care and emergency response that so many need. The causes of this, it depends on the locality, it depends on the situation. In some locations, in some areas, we find and we see that there is obstruction to humanitarian response, in some cases by the different factions, the different warring factions, particularly in conflict and crisis situations. In some cases, we also find there's an enormous amount of misinformation about the role of UN agencies, not just IOM, the International Organization for Migration, the UN's migration agency, which I represent, but all kinds of UN agencies, misinformation about their role, accusations of political bias, which sometimes can be a driver for obstruction to giving humanitarian response. And also sometimes, as you said, and as I explained, can lead to loss of life of humanitarian workers.
So do we expect, or should we expect the UN to have stronger conventions, laws to sort of help protect humanitarian workers?
Well, there are already in place significant protections for humanitarian workers. And I know sometimes being a humanitarian worker feels so distant to people. It's not clear what more can be done to explain to different sides of any situation that the role of humanitarian workers is really a humanitarian and emergency response role and a neutral role, and the opportunity to respond to the needs of, as I said, over 300 million people today affected by conflict and crisis and in need of humanitarian assistance is so critical. So the messaging, the communication, the explanation of the role of humanitarian workers is the key thing, and to ensure that the messages are clear to people that humanitarian workers are really there to respond to the needs of people. And as I said earlier, those needs are in many instances, not just in this region where we have the situation in South Sudan, the situation in parts of Ethiopia. It's not just the humanitarian aid in terms of water, shelter, accommodation, but sometimes life skills, vocational skills to help people rebuild their lives.
And talking about regions, the UN recently reported the worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen. We've also heard the situation in Tigray is precarious. But then there's also East Africa, soaring levels of hunger, I mean, the drought situation, and then the famine as well. How much has been done?
That's right, Millicent. This region, East Africa, Eastern Horn of Africa, I'm speaking to you from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, is in the midst of one of the worst droughts, if not the worst droughts that has been seen in 4 decades, in 40 years. UN agencies like IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and other organizations are calling for the world to respond to the needs of some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities on earth, frankly. And some of the appeals, many of the financial appeals needed haven't been met. There is still an enormous amount of need. I can tell you that in Somalia, on Kenya's border, more than 1 million people are currently affected by the drought. And the call is from IOM and other agencies is for the humanitarian world and the donor community, obviously, in particular, to respond to those needs. The crisis, of course, that has been brought on by drought is obviously induced by the ongoing evolution, if you like, of climate change displacement and migration, climate change driven displacement and migration. And we're seeing that is causing competition for resources amongst, as I say, some of the world's already most vulnerable people. So the message is clear, the call is clear, there needs to be a response. There needs to be much greater aid given to these individuals who are impacted by, in many instances, crisis not brought on by themselves.
Yvonne Dega is the spokesperson, International Organization for Migration and the UN. We'd like to thank you. We do hope that things get better for humanitarian workers and for the world. Thanks again. Let's go over to other stories. An Islamic State group militant from the United Kingdom has been sentenced to life in prison by a U.S. court for his involvement with a terror cell. 34-year-old El Shafi El Sheikh was convicted in April of hostage-taking conspiracy to murder U.S. citizens and supporting a terrorist organization. The Sudanese-born Londoner was the highest-profile IS fighter to stand trial in the United States. His actions are said to have resulted in the deaths of 4 U.S. hostages. Journalists James Foley, Stephen Soutlove, and aid workers Kayla Mueller and Peter Kasich were all kidnapped and killed at the hands of the cell. Meanwhile, today, the Australian Prime Minister confirmed that Umar Patek, an Indonesian man jailed for his role in the deadly 2002 Bali bombings that killed hundreds of people, has had his sentence reduced. Umar was sentenced to 20 years in prison in 2012 after he was found guilty of mixing the 700-kilogram bomb that ripped through 2 Bali nightclubs a decade earlier, killing 202 people, including 88 Australians. A member of the militant group, Jemaah Ismailah, Patek was also jailed for his role in the bombings of several Jakarta churches on Christmas Eve in 2000 that killed at least 15 people. After more than a decade in prison, Patek was granted a 5-month reduction to his sentence as part of a series of remissions granted to inmates on Indonesia's Independence Day, August 17.
And I say that this will have a devastating impact on the families. They are going through a trauma in memory of their lost loved ones. We lost 88 Australians in that terrorist attack, and it was a barbaric attack. More than 200 people lost their lives, 88 Australians. Those 88 Australians were all sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, fathers, mothers. Young people lost their lives. So many people lost their lives. So it's not just the 88. There are thousands of people who've been impacted by this. And certainly the Australian government will be conveying diplomatically very clearly our view of this, which is this further reduction in sentence. There have been reductions before in the past of the original sentence of this person. Well, the Indonesian government have made clear the decision that they've made. They informed us of that decision, and we informed them of our view of that decision. They have a system whereby when anniversaries occur, quite often sentences are reduced and commuted for people. But when it comes to someone who's committed such a heinous crime, a designer and maker of a bomb designed to kill people, to kill and maim, then we have a very strong view. But Indonesia, of course, is a sovereign nation, but we do respectfully put forward our view in the strongest possible terms about this.
Over to North Korea, where Kim Jong-un's sister had strong words for South Korea's president after he once again offered economic aid to Pyongyang if they agreed to denuclearize. State media reported that Kim Yo-jong said of the South's leader, Yoon Suk-yeol, it would have been more favorable for his image to shut his mouth rather than talking nonsense, as he had nothing better to say. Yoon first proposed what he himself has described as an audacious plan back in May. He next brought it up Wednesday at a news conference marking his first 100 days in office. South Korea's Unification Ministry, which handles relations with the North, warned of further isolation and a worsening economic crisis. They said the Unification Ministry expresses strong regret over North Korea's denouncement of our president with a rude expression and distortion of our idea instead of responding to our audacious plan, and also showing their intention of continuing nuclear development today. Kim Yo-jong has become a vocal critic of South Korea in recent years. Her comments on today mark the first time a senior North Korean official has commented directly on Mr. Yoon's plans. Meanwhile, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un held a ceremony to thank and praise military medics for spearheading the country's fight against the coronavirus in the capital, Pyongyang. Thousands of medics of Korean People's Army who had been dispatched to the emergency anti-epidemic front were discharged after Kim declared victory over COVID-19 and eased restrictions last week. Mr. Kim held the event at the April 25 House of Culture in Pyongyang to celebrate the medics' heroic feat on the front line of the COVID battle in the country's most populated city. Local media said this week that the medics had returned to their units without a sending-off ceremony, but Kim said he had felt empty and sorry that he had not done enough to publicly recognize their sacrifice. Over in Taiwan, its President Tsai Ing-wen addressing hundreds of the island's Navy service members to thank them for their service amid, quote, indescribable pressure from China. China, which claims self-ruled Taiwan as its own, has ramped up military exercises around the island this month in the wake of high-profile diplomatic visits from the United States. During a visit to the Sao Naval Base on Taiwan's northeastern coast, Tsai told sailors that fulfilling their mission in the tight confines of a ship must have been difficult. She separately emphasized that Taiwan will neither provoke nor escalate conflict during the crisis, and the island's defense ministry has stressed its calm response to Chinese military activity. To another matter involving China, the foreign ministry today sidestepped a question on whether President Xi Jinping will attend the G20 summit on the resort island of Bali this November. A long-time advisor to Indonesia's President Joko Widodo, who is popularly known as Jokowi, said Chinese and Russian leaders Xi and Vladimir Putin will attend the G20 summit. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin told a regular news briefing China attaches importance to the important role of the G20 as the main forum for international economic cooperation. It fully supports Indonesia in hosting the G20 Bali summit. The trip would be significant given it would be Xi's first time outside China since January 2020 when he visited Myanmar. China maintains a zero-COVID policy that has all but shut its borders to international travel. Still to come on the program. We'll tell you about the inflatable building built in the United Kingdom to explore how people would potentially live on Mars. Stay with us. And fires, floods and storms continue to rage across the world. For some areas like New Zealand, days of extreme weather have forced many from their homes. And it has also exposed some other dangers. Take a look.
Torrential rain hit parts of New Zealand for a fourth day today, forcing hundreds of people from their homes as rivers overflowed their banks and waterlogged ground becomes unstable. Nelson on the north coast of the South Island has been worst affected, with more than 400 homes evacuated and some declared uninhabitable because of the rains. Residents say it's heartbreaking.
The hill basically just collapsed, so there was a massive landslide happening, landslip, sorry. So we checked outside, and then we saw the dirt rolling straight to our property. So we just, left the property at about 8:15, straight to a motel, and I came this morning to assess the situation. It's pretty bad.
I'm the group manager infrastructure for the Nelson City Council, and the damage that I saw in Nelson was heartbreaking. I think that we're years away from a recovery, and the point was that as we were driving, there were slips falling everywhere, and to be honest, I don't know what that assessment will be. We're still in the response mode. We will have to assess that, and that'll be part of the recovery, and I just don't know at the moment.
Weather forecaster Met Service says Nelson had 172 millimeters of rain since Tuesday, August 15th, which is more than double its average August rainfall. Another 190 millimeters is expected to fall in the hills near Nelson over the next day. Meanwhile, southern Italy remained in the grip of a heat wave, with temperatures climbing close to 40 degrees, fueling wildfires on the island of Sicily. Firefighters battled early on Friday, August 19th, a wildfire on Mount Griffon, on the outskirts of Palermo. Smoke caused traffic jams on the highway connecting Palermo to Catania. Sadly, 2 people were killed by falling trees in central Italy as powerful storms battered several regions after weeks of punishingly high temperatures. Italy's civil protection unit said that the bad weather will sweep south overnight and issued warnings for today for 11 of the country's 20 regions. A man and a woman were crushed to death by trees in separate incidents in Tuscany, while 4 people were injured when a tree fell in a campsite in the same region. The wind blew more than 140 kilometers per hour in some parts of northern Italy, damaging beach resorts in Liguria and Tuscany, according to meteorologists. Europe's worst drought in years has pushed the mighty river Danube to one of its lowest levels in almost a century, exposing the hulks of dozens of explosive-laden German warships sunk during World War II near Serbia's river port town of Prahovo. The vessels were among hundreds scuttled along the Danube by Nazi Germany's Black Sea Fleet in 1944 as they retreated from advancing Soviet forces and still hamper river traffic during low water levels. However, this year's drought, viewed by scientists as a consequence of global warming, has exposed more than 20 hulks on a stretch of the Danube near Prahovo in eastern Serbia, many of which still contain tons of ammunition and explosives and pose a danger to shipping. Over in Germany, it's a dire prognosis for the country's 5 alpine glaciers, according to glaciologist Christoph Meyer of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences in Munich, who thinks they could all disappear within the next 15 years. Germany's glaciers are facing particular tough times. One German glacier, called Schäferner, is located on top of the Zugspitze, the country's highest mountain. Since records began in 1901, never has the snow depth on the Zugspitze been so low in July, according to the environmental research station Schöffenhaus, which is located on the glacier.
To other stories, the Canadian High Commissioner to Nigeria, Mr. James Christoph, says the Nigerian community there is taking up all its own place and really contributing in all aspects, economically, culturally, politically, and socially in Canada. Mr. Christoph stated this when he paid a visit to the Chairman CEO, Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, NIDCOM, Honorable Bike Dabiri Erewa in Abuja. According to the High Commissioner, the visit became necessary because of the growing and impressive Nigerian diaspora population. For the NIDCOM boss, there is a huge diaspora population in Canada, making Nigeria proud in all endeavors.
We have a huge diaspora population in Canada and doing great things in Canada and making us very proud. So ours is to engage with them, what they can also do back home in their home country, Nigeria. And a lot of Nigerians are, immigrants in Canada working and also remitting money back home. And we're proud of the Canadian Nigerians, and they are really doing great things here. And we're also working hard to engage the younger generation of Nigerians in Canada, because I know that you have a lot of infrastructure for that in Canada. And we look forward to further engagement with you and continuous engagement with our diaspora community in Canada, and we really are proud of what they are doing.
The mandate of the Diaspora Commission, but more importantly in this case, the growing and impressive Nigerian diaspora in Canada, and where we can work to collectively harness, I think, the good energy that's there to the benefit of both countries. And so we had a very good discussion, and I look forward to working with the chair over the coming months to do what we can to really bring a light to a very important part of Canada's overall cultural mosaic. I mean, we're a country of immigrants, but the Nigerian community is taking up its own place in Canada, really contributing in all aspects of our society.
South Africa is still celebrating women all through the month of August, and in that light, the Nigerian Women's Association in South Africa gathered to celebrate their own in Johannesburg. Present were all friends, also friends from other countries, and the theme, Women and Nation Builders, Social Cohesion, the Road of Women is Societal Development, bearing good ambassadors were some of the issues raised by guest speakers.
The women were not shy to let down their hair in celebration of Women's Month, but the gathering wasn't only about that.
It's a pleasure to join you at this very important summit.
The chairman, chief executive of the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Honorable Abike Dabiri Erewa, who sent a recorded video message, encouraged the gathering to empower themselves to participate actively in nation building. Other speakers touched on cohesion and finding common ground for cooperation on the continent, as well as the role of women in Africa's socio-economic development.
Throughout history, the central role of women in society has ensured stability, the progress, and the long-term development of nations. When women are empowered and can claim their rights and access to land, leadership, opportunities and choices, economy tends to grow. Any economy where women are empowered, you will see such economy growing.
Representing the Nigerian High Commissioner as well as the Consul General was the Minister for Trade and Industry, Mrs. Ijoma Nwizu. She assured the participants of improved consular services for them, but the ladies were also reminded to be good ambassadors of Nigeria and Africa, always.
We all know that the task of building a better Nigeria is the task for all Nigerians. And while outside the shores of Nigeria, we all become ambassadors of our great country. Hence, we need to protect the image of the country and portray the country in positive light.
To improve the society, as well as the cooperation between Nigeria and South Africa, so that they don't see that bad image in Nigerians, and basically, you just do your best.
My message to all African women is that they must let us hold ourselves together. We mustn't segregate and say, you come from this, I come from that. We are one. Let us all work together as women to build nations, to build the community, to build the family together.
The Nigerian Women's Association South Africa draws together indigenous Nigerian women from different fields based in South Africa with the main aim of peer support and positive projection of Nigeria. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
And finally on the program, an inflatable building that explores how people would potentially live on Mars has been built in the British city of Bristol. The public art project explores what a house on Mars could be like and aims to help us reassess how we live on Earth. Artists Ella Good and Nikki Kent spent 7 years bringing together space scientists, architects, engineers designers, and even school children to think about how we can live more sustainably.
The key thing about when you're living on Mars is you need your buildings to be completely airtight because the atmosphere outside is essentially poisonous. You then need to be able to keep out all the dangerous solar and cosmic radiation. So you need to have the outside made of something which will keep all those dangerous rays out. So our house partially would be built underground in the amazing lava tubes which exist under the surface of Mars. That's where the bedrooms and bathrooms would be. And then above ground would be a living room, this gold inflatable section that you see behind us. And that would be filled with a homemade concrete made of the water and crusty earth that you get on planet Mars that would then go hard and protect you from the rays that exist around you. And we're essentially using the inflatable structure as a formwork for our concrete enclosure.
Mars is closer to home than living on the moon would be, say. We could provide a lot of the home comforts with a lot of effort. So the effort in terms of the water would be melting it or purifying it. The effort in terms of providing lighting would be, okay, when there's a dust storm, we can't use solar panels, what are we going to use? Are we going to use hydrogen cells? Are we going to use nuclear power? But I think there's a lot of potential there to have a more human lifestyle, more Earth-like lifestyle than we might imagine.
Mars on Earth, everyone. That's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.